Throughout history, prior to the 20th century, this deadly infection called rabies has always horrified mankind. Stories of men turning into wild beasts and foaming at the mouth stretch all the way back to ancient Greece. The Spanish in the 15th century believed that only witches' dogs could produce such a terrifying disease. From 1730 to 1735, true-life vampire and werewolf tales were the main subjects spoken of in draft rooms of England, Germany, and France. Early vampire and werewolf sightings coincided with the same time period in certain areas of Europe where they were experiencing outbreaks of rabies. The country of Hungary during the 1700s was devastated by a widespread contagion of rabies in dogs, wolves, and humans. Due to the effect this virus has on the human brain, many have come to believe that rabies is the perpetrator for the vampire and werewolf tales. These horror stories began in the 18th century in Eastern Europe and continues today. Because rabies is a viral disease, which does require research done with an electronic microscope, early scientists could not even begin to understand how this deadly virus operates. Some educated men in those early days even tried to explain the cause of these horrific behaviors as possible symptoms of food poisoning or opium use. Spanish neurologist Dr. Juan Gomez Alonso wrote that because the disease is able to spread from organism to organism through biting, rabies may serve as part of an explanation for one of history's oldest horrors, the vampire and werewolf stories. For example, Dr. Alonso points out that the life of a vampire and rabies victim is around 40 days. A rabid-infected person's teeth will at times clench or retract the lips, like that of a snarling beast. The rabies virus affects the hypothalamus part of the brain that controls sleep, causing insomnia in the infected person to wander around at night. The rabies virus can also cause sensitivity to bright light. Novels that were published in the 1800s, such as the ones written by the Bronte sisters, used the rabies infection often as some sort of plot devices for their stories. One of the most famous rabies cases from the 19th century was of Maria Caroline Duff, wife of the Earl of Fife. In 1805, in Edinburgh, Scotland, 4 dogs of the Duff family suffered bites from a rabid animal. 3 of the dogs were put down immediately. Mrs. Duff could not bear to lose her cherished lapdog. Over time, rabies symptoms began surfacing in the French poodle and eventually in the lap dog's owner. Her husband could only watch as she and her pet went through agonizing spasms together before eventually succumbing to their illness. The French, in the 19th century, believed that rabies could actually transform a man into a savage animal. Even some astrologers believe that certain lunar eclipses in a particular month causes rabid outbreaks among the dog populations. The famous author Edgar Allan Poe revolutionized the horror genre in America by writing stories of characters descending into depredations of madness. In a bizarre twist of fate, it is believed Mr. Poe mysteriously contracted the deadly rabies virus in 1849. After being found with a high fever and lying unconscious on the streets of the city of Baltimore, Poe was taken to the city hospital. He soon began conversing with imaginary objects on the walls, along with uncontrollable violent rages, before dying 4 days later. What struck the physicians at the hospital were periods of lucidness Poe experienced, in between the violent behavior and convulsions. On the night of August 4th, 1868, in Kansas Fort Larned, a large rabid gray wolf strolled in off the prairie and into the army post, furiously biting and snapping at everyone and everything. Frothing at the mouth, the crazed wolf hurled over the rails of a colonial porch where some of the officers and their wives were sitting, enjoying the evening air. The mad beast savagely attacked Colonel Winecoop before breaking away and running across the parade grounds and into the barracks hospital. A corporal who was lying in one of the beds recovering from a previous illness was so savagely bitten that his right arm was nearly torn off him. The crazed wolf then continued on towards a sentry stationed at the guardhouse. The guard fired a shot at the charging wolf but missed, enabling the wolf to also savagely bite him. After biting an African-American soldier of the 10th Cavalry, the wolf entered the cabin of a sleeping woman and attacked her in her bed. The thick blankets that covered her prevented the teeth of the infected animal from penetrating her skin. Finally, the wolf was put down on the border of the reservation by a weld shot from a soldier. The rabies virus was well known to the early settlers in America and Canada. A skunk bite was considered very fatal to early settlers. Canadians referred to the rabies-carrying skunk as the child of the devil because of its sinister black coat. The infection in skunks more likely spread by the Western exploration of the country in the 1800s. Rabid skunks can be ferocious biters. They are the most important reservoir of rabies everywhere in the U.S., except the East Coast. Rabies can be hard to detect in skunks. An example of a rabid skunk would be it being active during daylight hours. Former President Theodore Roosevelt wrote in one of his hunting memoirs about an overly aggressive skunk that he encountered while on one of his many hunting trips. He referred to the skunk as a phobie cat, phobie being short for hydrophobia, a symptom caused by being bitten by a rabid skunk. While Roosevelt and his companions slept in a small log hut, they were awakened by a crazed skunk burrowing under their log hut, determined to get inside where the men slept. The skunk was finally shot dead by one of the hunters with a pistol. In western Wyoming, near the Green River, another document from 1833 told of a rabid animal attacks that went on for 2 nights. Multiple fur traders in the month of July from the Rocky Mountain Fur Company were attacked by a rabid wolf that ravaged through the camps as they slept. After all the hands retired that evening to their tents, nothing could be heard except loud snoring and an occasional shout of "All's well." Suddenly, cries of "I'm bitten" rang out from the darkness as a rabid wolf tore through their camps. Along with their cattle, 3 men were horribly bitten on the face. 2 days later, one of the bulls that were bitten began bellowing and pawing at the ground. One of the infected men, an Indian, suddenly threw himself down off his horse and began barking like a wolf. Why another man rolled around on the ground, foaming at the mouth and gnashing his teeth. The third victim ended up tearing his clothes from his body, running off into the woods, never to be seen again. In the 19th century, a rabies vaccine for humans and dogs was invented by a veteran of the Napoleon Wars named Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur went on to study physics, chemistry, and microbiology, choosing rabies as an object of study because of its subtle and mysteriousness of all other diseases. Pasteur soon learned that the rabies virus could not be produced in a lab like bacteria, but could only be obtained from living tissue of an infected thing. So, Louis Pasteur and his assistants would risk their lives by holding down a snapping dog, while Pasteur would carefully take a sample of the infected animal's saliva from its foaming mouth. Louis Pasteur would create a highly immunologic, fast-acting rabies vaccine that would be made up of dead strands of the rabies virus. This vaccine would be given in a series of 13 injections into the patient's upper abdomen. These series of 13 shots would be from a post-mortem spinal tissue of a dead rabbit, which harbored the rabies virus. The final shot would be from a rabid-infected dog's spinal cord. The dead rabies virus forces the white blood cells in the patient's body to divide up, creating antibodies, which then will regroup and attack the invading virus. The vaccine protection strain would interrupt the deadly path of the rabies virus as it worked its way towards the brain, eventually driving the virus from the body altogether. The vaccine treatment must be received prior to the onset of symptoms, otherwise death is usually inevitable. It wasn't discovered until later that a sample of the virus could be obtained from the animal's brainstem after the animal had died. At the start of the 1930s, American Deep South began experiencing an increase in rabies associated with raccoons. This particular strain of rabies allows the animal to live with the infection long enough to transmit the virus to another host. Even though the canine vaccine was readily available, only 40% of dog owners in the South vaccinated their dogs. This ended up producing more than 250 rabies deaths in the America South during the 1930s. This was confined mainly to Florida and neighboring states. It began spreading slowly throughout the Deep South at a rate of 24 miles a year. By the late 1930s, the rabies virus in dogs in Birmingham, Alabama was put at 1%. Ironically, during this time, a motion picture came out in the American theaters called Werewolf of London. People everywhere were shocked as they witnessed for the first time a normal human being transforming into a snarling, mouth-foaming, rabid beast. The close of the 1970s brought a distribution of rabies associated with raccoons, which spread rapidly along the eastern coast of the United States. The reason believed for this outbreak is that in 1977, more than 3,500 raccoons were legally trapped in Florida and shipped to private hunting clubs in Virginia and released in the wild to be hunted as sport. Unfortunately, some of these raccoons migrated into nearby states, producing Virginia's first case of rabies in 1977. In 1996, raccoon rabies had spread into northeast Ohio from western Pennsylvania. The Ohio Department of Health, USDA Wildlife Services, and the Division of Wildlife had produced an oral rabies vaccine baiting program. This involved dropping hundreds of thousands of vaccine-laden baits in a zone near the Pennsylvania border. These baits were the size of a matchbox and were coated with fish meal and a vanilla wax. However, in 2004, the raccoon rabies virus emerged in Ohio beyond the borders into an area where the oral rabies vaccine had been distributed. By 2005, 77 rabid raccoons were detected in Lake Geauga and Cuyahoga counties. This forced officials to ask whether these observation strategies are sufficient for contaminant of rabies.
Absolutely. She just got spayed.
My name is Linda Maccabee. I've been a certified veterinary technician for 32 years, and I sold pharmaceuticals. I sold rabies vaccines.
For adoption.
For 3 years, I did rabies work in Pinellas County, Florida. Instrumental in putting down the oral recombinant vaccine for raccoons and testing. Right now I'm teaching at Stotzenberger College in Brecksville. I teach anatomy and physiology and introduction to anesthesia. My personal experience with rabies was 1994. There was a rabies outbreak in Pinellas County, Florida, and our first case was a horse. And the owners of the horse said the horse was acting strangely. They called later on in the day and said it was kicking down the stall. So, unfortunately, the owners of the horse shot it with a gun in the head. And the director at Animal Services, I was working at Pinellas County Animal Services at the time, they said, bring the horse over, trailer the horse over if you can, the body. So what we did was we sent the brain of the horse to the state laboratory, and it was confirmed that it was rabies. What they can do is to find out where the rabies originated from this particular horse. They can isolate the gene, so to find out if it's bat rabies or raccoon rabies. And this happened to be raccoon rabies. And within a couple months, we had quite a few cats that were attacking people, and they wound up being rabid. So we applied to the state for funding. We got a grant to purchase the oral rabies vaccine. And I don't know if you've heard about this, but anyway, the oral rabies vaccine was made by Roan Marieux, and Roan Marieux was the first company to come out with rabies vaccine. It's the original Pasteur rabies vaccine. This particular rabies vaccine, what they do is they put it in a little plastic pocket, and then they put it in a fish meal bait, and it's about 1 inch square. Smells like heck, but it smells just like fish food. And what it's supposed to do as it warms up is attract raccoons. And raccoons will come in, hopefully, they're the target species. They will come in, find this little bait, they'll bite into it, and just the action of them biting into it releases a vaccine which replicates in the tonsils, because the tonsils are right there, and that's a big area for replication for things like this. So anyway, rabies in and of itself, the vaccines, when they first made the vaccines, there's different vaccines. There's live, there's modified live, there's killed, and then there's recombinant. This particular vaccine is a recombinant vaccine. And I'm going to draw this out for you because, so let's say this is rabies. If you were to inject live wild rabies virus into something, you're going to give it rabies. So they tried using a modified live rabies, which didn't work. That reverted to virulence. If you take a virus and you modify it, you can either freeze it or heat it or just kind of cripple it a little way. But there's always that chance that that crippled virus can walk again, or it can revert to virulence. So then they took rabies, a virus vaccine, and they made it killed. So they completely disabled this virus. The problem with that is when you inject it into an animal, the body just doesn't recognize it. It's like, who cares? You've just introduced something that's killed and it doesn't pose a threat, so the body doesn't try to build immunity against it. So drug companies figured out if you introduce something with the vaccine, when you inject it, to cause a reaction, so white blood cells rush to the site and the body builds immunity. So they figured out aluminum. And this is where I think a lot of people start talking about like autism and all this other stuff. The amount of aluminum is so minute. I mean, it's a microscopic amount of aluminum. But what happens when you introduce aluminum to a body, that's a foreign substance. It's inexpensive, it's foreign, it's not gonna hurt anything. So the body says, holy crap, what's that? Rushes to the site to get rid of it, and then says, oh my God, there's rabies here, okay? So, but it's a killed rabies virus. Now, if you want to introduce a rabies vaccine to an animal and you want it to take effect quickly without reverting to virulence, what you can do is take this strand of genetic material, and scientists have figured out which little piece, and let's just say for the sake of argument, it's this piece. If you take out this piece and put it into a vaccine, and then don't add aluminum, don't do anything else, but this is live, okay? Nothing's been done to this other than you've just taken a little piece of the virus apart. Introduce it into an animal, and don't do anything else, but this is live, okay? Nothing's been done to this other than you've just taken a little piece of the virus apart. Introduce it into an animal, the body says, holy crap, that's rabies, but it can't replicate because not everything is there. All the genetic coding's not there to replicate. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's what the oral vaccine is for raccoons. So they took this little portion out, and it's pretty expensive to do this, the recombinant technology. They take this out, they put it into this little packet, stuffed it inside a fish meal bait, but also what they did, they put in tetracycline, a small amount of tetracycline. Tetracycline, what it does is it gets into the enamel of the teeth. They're calling it a marker. So a little bit of tetracycline is in this fish meal bait vaccine. So when the raccoon bites into it, replicates in the tonsils, immunizes the raccoon against rabies. When we go out and trap raccoons, and we would take the canine tooth out, we already had the blood, and then we would take brainstem. So what we're doing is we were taking the brainstem, the tooth, and the serum, packaging that all up in one nice little package. At a laboratory in Texas, they could look at the tooth to see if there was tetracycline in there, because the raccoon had bitten into it, so there's a tetracycline marker. We could look at the serum, the blood, the serum-y part of the blood, to see if there was rabies virus in there. And also we could look at the brainstem, we could look to see if there was rabies, this raccoon actually had rabies. So then all of this was published after a few years. It was published, I think, in the year 2000.
In 1953, around 500,000 Americans were treated for infected bite wounds by animals. Out of that 500,000, 60,000 were exposed to rabies and had to receive treatment. Rabies in animals affects the sensory nerves, which overwhelms their senses and awareness. Once the virus reaches the brain, the animal is beyond any hope. The virus begins to distort the mind. It suppresses the normal ability to reason, while at the same time the virus invigorates the animal's aggressive behavior. As aggression rises to a fever pitch, the diabolical virus works its way from the brain and into the salivary glands of the animal in search of another host. With an abundant flow of saliva drooling from the mouth, the contaminated beast can either be mute and slack-jawed with paralyzed limbs, which is known as a paralytic or dumb rabies, or the animal can manifest rage, which is the more common form of rabies. It starts with a menacing gaze along with sudden, unpredictable lunges. This type of rabid animal seemed to be oblivious to their out-of-control rages. It periodically slumps over only to suddenly begin stumbling and snarling all over again. At times, a mournful howl can be heard coming from the dying animal. The only way to determine if an animal is infected with the rabies virus is to open up the skull of the animal and taking a sample from the brainstem. For this to even be done, the head must be removed so it can be sent to a qualified lab for testing. Removing the head of an animal alone can be difficult in itself, physically and emotionally, especially if the owner of the animal has to do it. For the head of the dog to be removed, the person will not only have to cut through the soft tissue, but also through the tightly bound tendons that hold the top vertebrae, the axis, and the atlas together.
This is a dog, this is a plastic dog skeleton. If the dog were to get in a scuffle with a raccoon, and let's say the raccoon is rabid, generally dogs are bitten around the face. Unfortunately, they're bitten around the face. Unfortunately, that is really close to the brain. So for the virus to travel up the spinal cord from the feet or something, unfortunately with dogs, it usually happens pretty quickly. Usually within 10 days of being bitten by a rabid animal, another animal will show signs of rabies. If your dog or cat shows signs of rabies, it has to be euthanized and humanely euthanized, and we use sodium pentobarbital. It's a humane method of euthanasia. And then, unfortunately, the head has to be sent to the state lab. The state lab, normally, when we have to decapitate any animal for rabies, we try to go in between the cervical vertebrae up here. I know this is kind of gruesome, but you try to leave a little bit of cervical vertebrae because the people at the state lab put the head on a little pedestal kind of thing. So they can take a circular saw and remove the skull and then the brain. And what they're looking for is a little inclusion body. It's called Negri bodies that are inside some of the brain cells. And they show up pretty well. It's pretty interesting. I've only had one cat that came into our shelter with active rabies. It got there about an hour before it died. I tried to call the county photographer to get over there and videotape it, but by the time he got there, the animal had died. So if you picture, I guess we used to say it looked like something on PCP or something. It was just insane, screaming, trying to, it was injuring itself on the cage. I don't think the animal had any awareness of what was going on at that point. It was just so, it was in rage.
Even the state of Maine, where the author of the book Cujo resides, 13 out of 16 Maine counties were reported to have been infected with the deadly raccoon rabies virus by 1999. The rabies infection can be tricky to diagnose since the symptoms do not become apparent for a couple of weeks or more after the transmission. Prior to the illness taking hold of an infected person, the animal bite where the virus entered will eventually heal over. This will allow the victim to even forget about the scrimmage they had with the beast. This conceals any evidence of an altercation. Once the virus enters the brain, the wound will seem to magically rematerialize, along with a peculiar sensation coming from the wound. This can range from extreme coldness to a stabbing, numbing pain. The rabies virus is the most fatal virus in the world. It's a disease that kills close to 100% of its victims, including 50,000 humans yearly worldwide. The actual virus is interestingly shaped like a bullet, with glycogen protein spikes covering the shell. This cylinder-shaped virus carries in it a shipment of round-shaped RNA. Like other viruses, the rabies enters in through the bloodstream, which is heavily guarded by immune protective sentries. These special calipers of endothelial cells allow the diffusion of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hormones in and out of the brain. This is done at the same time while blocking out anything that might seem a threat to the body. But this unique virus outwits this protective path and sets its new course through the nervous system. After binding into the peripheral nerves, which transmits electrical impulses to and from the brain, it can then slow down to a snail-like pace as it journeys its way up to the brain. This virus can take anywhere from 5 days to 5 years to reach its destination without manifesting any symptoms through the host. In the meantime, the protective sentries become stimulated and form a protective barrier, preventing any immune response to get into the brain for a defense. Once the rabies virus enters into the brain, the ill-fated person will typically display signs of influenza followed by a sore throat. By this time, the virus's grip begins to tighten as muscles stiffen. The nerves tense and the mind begins to fray with temper and apprehension. Once symptoms begin to appear, it's too late for the victim. Excessive saliva will occur along with fixed dilated pupils without reacting to any kind of light source. The cranial nerves can become paralyzed, paralyzing eye movements. Shortly after, a terrifying condition called hydrophobia will begin to take place. Rabies virus has also been transmitted through organ transplants. Surgical recipients of corneas and other organ transplants from patients who died of rabies can also transmit the rabies virus. Corneas has a rich supply of nerve fibers that the rabies virus travels to from the brain. Three recipients of different solid organ transplants became infected with the rabies virus because the organs came from a rabid 20-year-old Arkansas man. Because cocaine was found in the man's system, it was believed that the 20-year-old died from drug usage. It wasn't discovered until later that the donor lived in an apartment complex that contained bats. The patient that received the liver transplant was discharged 5 days after the transplant. The man was readmitted after experiencing tremors. Within 24 hours, his mental status deteriorated, rapidly dying 5 days later. A liver and 2 kidneys were transferred into 3 recipients on May 4, 2004 in Texas. The male patient that received the kidney transplant was discharged from the hospital 12 days later. He began experiencing twitching of the muscles and change in mental status. After developing respiratory failure, he was connected to a respirator. He died 10 days later. The island of Bali, which is a province of Indonesia, was considered a South Pacific paradise. $2 million foreigners visit the island every year, bringing in an annual $2.8 billion. The residents of the island mainly consist of Hindus that live and work side by side with their Muslim neighbors. Most of the Balinese own at least 1 dog per family because they believe that dogs ward off evil spirits. Throughout history, the island has always been labeled as a rabies-free island. The airport officials in Bali prided themselves in their practice of checking every dog's papers that come through their checkpoint. Unfortunately, no one thought of checking pets that arrived on the island's shores. These animals that arrived by boat would just trot off into the island's dog population without anyone being the wiser. Regrettably, the inevitable happened when two men arrived at the Bali shores in 2008, along with their two dogs. Not realizing their pets were harboring the fatal rabies virus, the two dogs not only infected the two men, but also bit several other island dogs, which in turn bit several islanders, including a child. It was not until the following month, after two more deaths, that the Bali government decided to take action. But by that time, 150 people were already infected with the rabies virus. Bali government officials, acting on impulse, ordered that any dog not on a leash was to be destroyed by any means possible. This brazen attempt by the Balinese government to keep the rabies virus outbreak contained failed after a rabid dog was found in the capital city of Denpasar. So, on January 18th, scores of local, high-ranking government officials participated in a Hindu ceremony held at the Panchak Mangu temple to seek some kind of spiritual intervention. But despite the extermination of 26,705 Bali dogs, along with 300,000 vaccinated, the rabies spread to 7 other regencies on the island. By 2009, rabid animals began permeating the New York suburbs. This included the favorite dog walking area, Central Park, with 124 documented cases of rabid raccoons. On February 16, 2010, after 40 cases of rabid raccoons were confirmed, the New York Health Department began setting collapsible cages around Central Park under the cover of darkness. This was done in order to catch and destroy the infected raccoons. The spread of rabies among raccoons was considered one of the most exhausting wildlife rabies outbreak in American history. In Louisiana, 2011, a 19-year-old Mexican man was the first person to die in America from a rabies-infected vampire bat. The teenager became ill 2 weeks after receiving the bite on his heel. He sought medical attention for fatigue, 101.1 fever, shoulder pain, and a drooping eye. After his death, a post-mortem test on the teen's brain tissue confirmed the variant to be vampire bat rabies. Vampire bats feed on blood, using a heat sensor in its nose to locate where the blood flows closest to the skin. Traditionally, vampire bats are found in warm climates such as Brazil and Argentina. But health officials warn that climate change is causing these bloodsuckers to move north and over the U.S. border, increasing the risk to humans and animals in America to rabies. In Ohio, after raccoons were tested positive for rabies in Stark County and Paris Township in 2017, health officials, in an attempt to control the virus, airdropped more vaccine baits by helicopters and planes around Stark, Carroll, and Columbiana counties. According to the Stark County Health Department, the oil rabies vaccine not only targeted raccoons, but also foxes and coyotes.
If your animal is getting its first vaccine, so let's say your animal is 3 or 4 months old and it's getting its first vaccine, there's a lot of antigen in that vaccine, a lot. So it's not like other vaccines where you have to do it at 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks for the immune system to go, oh, okay, I get this. That has a lot of antigen in it. All right, so it's 1 ml, so it's 1 cc. Come here, baby. Come on. I know. Oh, life's a bummer. Yeah. So generally, when we give it to our canine and feline companions, we do it in the right side, so we know where we gave it, so right rabies, and we pinch the skin, make a little pocket. I'm sorry. There. So now he is immunized one more time for rabies. So the body builds a great immune response to that vaccine quickly. An animal can get their first rabies vaccine at 12 weeks old. Around 12 to 16 weeks old is a good time to do it. Once they get it at 12 to 16 weeks, it should be boosted when they're a year old, and then you can go every 3 years. The vaccine itself is relatively inexpensive, fairly simple to make, really super safe. So I'm not sure why people don't get their animals vaccinated. I know you have some people because it's a law, it might be a county law or a state law, but you have some people that say, you're not going to tell me what to do. So things like that. Rabies is going to kill you. It's going to kill you. And anybody that has any concerns about vaccinating their animal, watch a video of someone dying from rabies. You can watch those online. It's horrible, absolutely horrible. I think there's a video, a gentleman in India dying from rabies. And I mean, if that doesn't make you get, a $5 or $15 vaccine in your animal, I don't know what it's going to take.
Even if somehow America succeeds in ridding rabies from all the four-legged animals, we would still be left with the bat rabies virus. On top of everything else, the bat rabies virus has been perfectly matched to the dog rabies virus. It is the perfect host to that particular strain and expresses itself in canine saliva at much higher levels than other animals. So as long as man practices that dogs are man's best friend, mankind will be at risk.